Small short story about my family, so it'll possibly explain why I collect U.S. possessions and principally Philippine stamps. My father was number four of eight children, four guys and four gals. Ultimately, the first daughter was number two in birth order. She was born May 15th, 1898. The rest of the family members were named Frank, Philomena, Joseph, Louis, Vincent, Teresa, and Marion. However, my aunt, who was born on May 15th, 1898, we have no idea what her original name would have been, but she was named Manila Olympia after the Battle of Manila Bay. So I collect U.S. possessions in memory of my father's older sister, and that's how I got started in possessions. The Before we begin to flick screens, there were other slides that covered other areas. So today we're trying to just cover the Philippine area and have some samples of the basic stamp and the application of overprints. The collection of Philippine stamps during the U.S. period is essentially a basic stamp with modifications at different times with different overprints or hand stamps. So, with that being said, I started in the mid 70s and collecting canal zone in the Philippines. And in the 70s and early 80s, I met many of the folks in the room. So I'm not sure when I met Craig, but we met very early on when our hair color was different and we all had uh, more hairs in our head. With that, please roll the screen, please. Keep going, please. Just the first, one more time. Okay, so the two pictured plate locks are the left 4-cent stamp was printed in Washington and sent to Manila probably around 1900. And that would be typical of many stamps of the period being printed in Washington and overprinted with a plain Philippines. Ultimately, a friend named Bob Hogue explained the OB hands on the plate block at the right, the force hand stamps on the left, or in the traditional vertical position, the two OB hand stamps on the right side are inverted. Bob mentioned that many plate blocks often have inverted hand stamps. Reason uncertain, but there are normal positions and there are inverted positions. So please roll. Okay, these original stamps or the 5 cents were part of the original stamps sent to the Philippines in 1899. The upper left is a 5-cent stamp with black letters, and the lower right stamp is a $2 stamp intentionally overprinted in red letters. So all of the Washington applied words for the Philippines and the cents values were in black ink, and intentionally the $1, the blue $2, and the $5 stamp were intentionally overprinted in red. And I think this was intentional so some folks in the post office may not give away a $2 stamp for 5 cents. So perhaps the red ink was a intentional device to help the local postmasters in the Philippines. Roll, please. Two beautiful special delivery stamps. A forward, I do not own every picture in the display. There are credits at the back. The lower left plate block of 883 is a normal, predictable special delivery stamp sent to the Philippines in 1900 era. And after the Philippines or the U.S. stamps were discontinued with the Philippine overprint, there was a request in 1907 for stamps reportedly requested by the Queen of Italy for sample stamps from the Philippines. However, the original running messenger on the 883 stamp, that printing plate had been destroyed. The messenger on the bicycle was the current stamp of the day, and it was overprinted with the red Philippines. There are two plate blocks known. There are potentially a maximum of 100 stamps. They never left Washington or they never left New York City. They are extremely rare. And if someone knows the current price, but I believe the upper right stamp 774 sold for more than $100,000, possibly 10 years ago. So the bicycle messenger printed in the US, never sent to the Philippines. Please roll. Postage due stamps were printed in two groups over a couple of years. The 1899 issues were the 1 cent, the 2 cent, and the 5 cent and the 50 cents. Later on, they overprinted in 1901, they overprinted the 30 cents and the 3 cents. So the 2 cent plate block on the left has a difficult plate number arising from the third shipment of the 2 cent stamps. The 30-cent plate block in the middle, there are perhaps 2 or 3 known. Pictured item is owned by a friend. And the 50-cent stamp on the lower right, there were 2 printings, and there are only 2 or 3 plate blocks known and a few plate number strips. Please roll. Okay, the original stamps sent to the Philippines were called the First Bureau stamps in Washington. At some time, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing changed from the first Bureau series to the second Bureau series, and they created a full run of values from the 1 cent up to a $5 stamp. So the 1 cent on the left side, millions of 1 cent green stamps sent to the Philippines. The beautiful orange plate block is owned by someone I don't know. It's absolutely perfect in every way. The blue $2 stamp with the red ink overprint. There is one item on eBay. The initial price on eBay was $32,000 and change, and the current price is lowered to $22,000 for a similar or better plate block than what is illustrated here as the $2. Down to the 4 cents, originally set up side by side for the display. There were generally a first shipment sent to the Philippines, 5 or 10,000 stamps of every value. Philatelists could not get their hands on them. Ultimately, Washington made a second printing and set the second printing a few years after. So over the years, the ink color changed from the early printing on the lower left 4 cent stamp, and the later or the second printing, the color had changed. In addition, there are a series of letters in the left selvage. Generally, they run in pairs. I personally did some research in Bureau of Engraving and Printing in 1980s, and the pairs of letters appear to be related to nominally 1 week. And so it appears that at Friday night, a printing plate was taken off the press, or a cleaner came in and cleaned the printing plate over the weekend, and the printer who picked up the work on Monday put his initials in the left selvage margin. And again, there are years between the plate block on the left and the darker brown plate block on the right, but sometimes more or less letters indicate when the stamp was printed. An early printing versus a later printing, a shade difference from one to the shade difference on the other. Please roll. This is kind of unique. It has 2 cent stamps of the second bureau. And I'm sorry, pictorially, I did not display it correctly. The design of the 2 cent stamps was changed in Washington, and the Philippines requested booklet panes. So the 240 booklet pane was printed and overprinted and shipped to Manila. And that was all fine and good, normal, everyday activity. The next printing job in Washington, D.C. was the Canal Zone at the top right with plate number 2217. And because that was nominally a new printing in June of 1904, there are no letters, no printer's initials in the left selvage. The last item printed is on the left with the same plate number, but instead of being overprinted with the Canal Zone, it was overprinted with the Philippines. And again, there's a series of letters on the left-hand selvage. And by counting the pairs and looking at some personal records in Washington, the pairs of letters indicate that the left plate number block was printed possibly in September of 2004, while the Canal Zone same printing plate was used in July. Now, for some reason unbeknownst to myself, this printing plate appears to have been the normal printing plate of the day in Washington, and it appears to have been in weekly use for 2 or 3 months. So the Canal Zone overprint was applied in June or July, and the same printing plate was still working, and different printers, apparently on a weekly basis, entered their initials in the left-hand selvage of 2217. So I'm sorry, I did not say anything in the beginning. If someone has a question, please stop me and I'll try and answer your question as best I can. So for me, I'm a collector of plate blocks, and it took me several decades to come up with 2217 with a Canal Zone and a Philippine. And these were not quick, easy purchases. At the end, they were intentional, deliberate acquisitions, possibly taking 10 or 20 years to acquire one piece and then the other piece. Okay. Thank you. Please roll. In the U.S. government overprinted regular U.S. stamps when the areas from the Spanish-American War, the political status was not known. So in my mind, the application of the word Cuba or Guam or Philippines or Puerto Rico was a temporary event to indicate a U.S. military occupation because the politicians had not decided the political status after the end of the Spanish-American War. At some point in time, they decided to print stamps for the Philippines because the political status was determined at the time that it would be a U.S. administrative territory. Ultimate decision as to the form of government not known, but they started in 1906 printing the plate block up on the left. And there are many numbers of 2-cent plate blocks going from the 21,000 series on the top left to the 121,000 series on the bottom right. And there are a few in the 122,000 series. Normally, they run in groups of 4, or the plate numbers run in groups of 4, not always sequentially, sometimes a skip or 2 in the numbers. But at the end of the day, my personal attraction was I saw a stamp and then I saw it with different overprints at different points in time. So the one basic stamp was in use from 1906 until 1935. Having said that, when you get a chance to view the Washington records, they do totalize the shipments to the Philippines on a fiscal year basis, but they do not have any collector definitions as to paper watermarks, perforation gauges, and any other philatelic adjectives that we might find in the Scott catalog. So the total number of 2-cent stamps from 1906 through 1935 is known in my other works or my books. I've tried to break these shipments down by a certain year, and thus my statistics are now printed in Mr. Scott's good book for the last 10 or 12 years on the U.S. Specialized Catalog. However, some of the statistics on the plain 2-cent stamp on the upper left could vary by 100,000 or 200,000 stamps, depending on what was shipped in a certain particular year. The stamp at the upper right, or the plate block at the upper right, has the word specimen, and this is associated with the Lambert Company in Manila. In a random search in the attic of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, a gentleman now retired, a Mr. Gus A. Bad, said, "Why don't you look in the box over here?" He said, "I have no idea what's in the box, but people have always looked in this box in the past." And so he said, "Why don't you spend 5 minutes looking at the box?" And I pulled the box, and there was a traditional manila folder, and there were 3 printing orders. One was the amount for the Lambert Sales Company. Second was a shipment sent to the Manila Post Office so that they could sell imperfs to ordinary citizens of the Philippines. And the third printing order was for stamps for specimen use. They were not hand stamped with the word specimen in the USA. When the Manila Post Office got them, they applied the hand stamp to this 2-cent plate block and to another plate block, and they are hand stamps and not overprints. That means that each individual hand stamp has its own personality as to its coordinates, southwest, northeast, north, south. They're all similar, but they're not identical. And there'll be another Lambert in a slide later that will help explain this. Later on, the airmail services of the world expanded, and many flying boats flew the Pacific. Traditionally, the Pan Am Clipper is the most notable U.S. stamp or U.S. flight, but other aviators from the Philippines flew to Spain. Some Spanish aviators flew to Manila. And obviously, there was no way for the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing to be able to put a commemorative re-end flight information on the stamps. So the lower left plate block was overprinted in Manila. They took ordinary stamps of the day, possibly 100,000, and printed them or overprinted them with the commemorative event. The stamp in the middle is kind of unique. It's going to tie into a later slide. It's a airmail stamp. And again, that was created in the Philippines. Again, they took regular 2 centavo stamps from Manila and they locally overprinted the airmail stamps. The stamp at the right was overprinted for official business, and this was overprinted in Washington by machine. So the majority of the letters are whole and intact. Most of them have their periods in place, but occasionally a piece of cloth, a broken letter, there are some partial letters, under-inked areas. There are some unique OB letters that can be found. Many, many possibilities. Next one, please. I have this beautiful 4 peso stamp sent from Washington to the Manila post office, and the 3 hand stamps on the top row are nominally level 9 to 3 o'clock, and the bottom hand stamps are at varying nominal 45-degree angles for the lower row. Whether this was intentional application of the word specimen on the angle or the hand stamp person was getting fatigued and he just wanted to get through the act of hand stamping. There is a bit of a mystery about the stamps that were held in the Manila post office as samples in the original records. During the reoccupation of the Philippines in February 1945, there were significant U.S. Army battles in and around the Manila post office building, and there was a significant amount of damage and looting. And no one knows exactly what happened to the specimens because they were reported to have been glued down to some kind of paper. Ultimately, in 1950 or so, the Rasdale Stamp Company in Chicago acquired the full pane of 100 stamps, and they cut the stamps into plate blocks of 6 and horizontal pairs. Possibly, I haven't seen any vertical pairs, but there were certainly horizontal multiples. And so exactly who did what and exactly when it happened is uncertain, except sometime between possibly 1941 and 1949. The stamps were rescued by someone and eventually made it to the US and sold in 1950. There is one set of top plate number blocks of 6, and there is a second companion set of bottom plate number blocks of 6. Please roll. This is a beautiful gem. I was lucky enough to get an image from the Ivy Mater stamp auction firm 20 or 30 years ago. There was a gentleman, Walter Mater, who was very active, and so I acquired this image from him. I can't tell you the year anymore. Obviously, it's a 10 cent, 10 peso stamp, plate block of 12 of 10 peso stamps. And it was worth $60 in 1925. And that had to be a small fortune for anybody in the USA or even in the Philippines to invest $60 or 120 pesos when people in North America may have been working for 25 cents an hour if they were lucky to have a job before the Depression. They may have been making 25 cents an hour. So acquiring and saving this from the Lambert Company was a small investment. The Lambert family heirs either lived in Northern California and or possibly Southern Oregon. I've heard many, many stories. I don't know what's true in whole or in part, other than to say the heirs of the Lambert Company sold stamps at different times, many of which went to a stamp dealer, Merrill Spencer in Walnut Creek, California. And in 1996, I attended the San Francisco show. It's where I met James for the first time. And we were all hoping to get to the stamp gallery table and meet Merrill Spence at his table at the 1996 show. And we all got to speak a few minutes, and he was off to a vacation with the family. So I personally never heard the whole story from one person over the years. Anyway, a great piece to look at. There is a companion block of 4 on the right side that have gone through Philatelic Society certification as being 1925 versus 1931s. It is possible to discern the difference on the lower values by the hardness or softness of the paper and the gum, of 1925 being a little bit softer and thinner than the 1931s. Some of the 1931s can be identified with at least a 20 power microscope. They have some wood chips or wood threads in the paper making process. There appear to be gold threads that someone has analyzed and said it was created in 1931. So there is a way to check the stamps beyond the paper thickness. You can also look in the white areas, and obviously you would need a stamp with some gold threads or one without gold threads, and that would be your personal comparative baseline to discriminate between a 1925 and a 1931. Please roll, Jim. No plate blocks. Joe Napp, how would you put stamps up without plate blocks? Well, very simple. These stamps were created and printed in Manila, and they did not have plate numbers or serial numbers on them. So the upper stamps are just plain regular stamps. And for comparison, the lower stamps were included to show the salvage did not have a plate number in the traditional area, but the stamps were printed in Manila. There are a few variations of ink shades of the frame, the post office building or the legislative palace building. There are a few with brown images. There are double impressions of a few values. There is one value with a triple impression, and the study of this issue should be left to a more competent person. Joe Napp is really not the right person because these stamps don't have plate numbers, but they do exist. They're great fun and they're readily available on the marketplace or on eBay. Thank you. Please roll. Okay. Joe Knapp's got a major beef with the Scott Catalog Company. When you go to Washington, all the records in Washington refer to the 1934 pictorial series. And the same stamps in Mr. Scott's good books are listed as 1935. So I respectfully defer to the original records in Washington, and I refer to these stamps and others with the number of 1934. So I am a little bit of a contrarian, saying 1934, not 1935. So the stamps would normally have been prepared as sheets of 100 stamps with a traditional plate number. These happen to be booklet pane stamps, and there were no booklet panes printed without, or for this series, there were no 1934 booklet panes printed. They had to wait to 1936 for the left image for a large size Commonwealth. For some crazy unknown reason, there are no engineering guidelines to indicate a position on the printing plate of 360 subjects. So you won't find any arrows, any vertical lines, any horizontal lines on the first issue with the large Commonwealth. A few years later, after criticism, people objected to the Commonwealth being too large and defacing the image of Rizal in this instance, but the overprints were too large, and they asked Washington to reduce the size of the Commonwealth overprint, and they did, and they printed a series of booklet panes. On the top right stamp, there's a small arrow going and a right side red engineering and guideline on the right hand side, and that establishes this booklet pane position B in nominally the middle of the 360 impressions on a sheet. Again, normal, all the traditional horizontal and vertical lines exist on the small Commonwealth overprint. So at some point, the original printing plate was sent back to engraving, and they put in the engineering guidelines, which were to facilitate the perforations and the cutting of wall stamps for the stamps going through the perforating machines. The third image shows a lower left stamp below the white arrow with a transposed wealth over common. Over the letters got changed. From personal research and back solving, the stamp was printed in August 1942 when the Japanese occupied Manila, and there were nominally 8,000 stamps printed for the Philippine government in exile in Washington, D.C., and some of these stamps were exited out the side door, and there are 24 possible transposed Kleisha stamps, and I have successfully pictorially identified all 24 known pieces, which ultimately equates to the total shipped in the annual reports. And these were sold or given to the Philippine Embassy in Washington, D.C. when the Japanese occupied Manila and the majority of the Philippine Islands. The last image is a 1944 or possibly a 1945 victory hand stamp applied to a large Commonwealth booklet pane. The stamps that are nominally reported as hand stamped on Lady Island, which is true. They were hand stamped in Tacloban on Leyte. There's a nearby island, I think it's pronounced Biliran. It's to the north side of Leyte Island, and administratively, it's part of Leyte Island, Leyte County, Leyte state government, or whatever the Philippine local government issue or subdivision is. So stamps were returned from 3 locations: Leyte Island, adjacent Samar, and Biliran Island. And so I have no idea where these stamps were returned. And the note underneath the word victory and says type 1 or Roman 1, that's incorrect. It should say type 2 because the victory rubber stamp broke and it was repaired with a pin. So the word victory has a slight break in it, and that's indicating it's a type 2 stamp, but I totally screwed up with my typo when I prepared this. Now, why are you talking about these? They don't have plate numbers. Now, Dick Larkin, a member of many clubs, was a very lucky person, and he has a 2-cent booklet pane with a partial lower left plate number. It's the only one that I've ever heard about, but there is the possibility that other plate numbers would exist at the four corners, depending on how the perforating and the cutting of the stamps was performed. But there's certainly one booklet pane with a plate number in a miscut salvage area, very similar to the white arrow on the transposed overprint. The Dick Larkin image or auction sale image had that partial number in the left salvage. So it's a quest for life to try and find plate number and for a booklet pane. Please roll. Okay. Probably the most common stamp in the Philippines. And regretfully, I screwed up. I omitted one image. I mailed James a file. There is a second file. But going back to the original statement, there are very few stamps printed for the Philippines. There's this basic series of every value, and then it gets modified with overprint. So the top left stamp is possibly a 1936, 35 or 36 printing. The middle stamp with the 588 on the right is a large size Commonwealth. Going back to the original comment that some people objected to the size of the overprint, and so the size of the overprint was reduced. Now, this upper right stamp 131 579 was a replacement printing plate. There were four numbers for the 588 series, and there were four numbers for four continuous numbers in a second series. And one of the original plates developed a defect. And the 131 579 was used for 3 days in November of 1941. And for my records, there are three known images of the upper right stamp, and a very good friend, collector, dealer, Elliot Coleman, acquired stamps from the H.E. Harris Company, possibly 20 or 30 years ago. And I was very lucky. Elliot had this great stamp, and I was able to purchase the upper right image from Elliot many, many years ago. The bottom left has a victory overprint. The victory had broken at this point in time. The hand stamp was repaired with a pin in the T. So on the left side of the vertical T, there's a gap. And so a stamp preserved, or stamps were taken from Leyte Island, Samar Island, and Biliran Island, and possibly other places. Philippine postal officials may have taken the stamps home, may have buried them, or may have left them in the post office, but the Japanese never found or destroyed all the stamps that existed before the war. Eventually, in November, December, and up through January, the word victory was applied to the 4-cent stamp on the lower left. My personal time in the U.S. Army was in a unit called Second Civil Affairs in Vietnam. And normally, Civil Affairs buries the dead civilians and feeds the hungry wives and kids after a little bit of dust up by the infantry. Anyway, Admiral Halsey, U.S. Navy, raided the Philippine Islands, destroyed Japanese planes in Greater Manila area, told General MacArthur that he could change his invasion plans of the Philippines. So General MacArthur originally planned to land in southern Mindanao at a place called Davao City, and he advanced his invasion date, and he landed on my 1-year birthday on October 20th, 1944. So I was perfectly 1 year old when General MacArthur landed at Red Beach with the 24th Infantry out there. However, no one told the Bureau of Engraving and Printing that the landing date was changed and they needed to hurry up with the Victory Commonwealth. So the stamps were ordered and they arrived in the Philippines exactly as they had been planned in January 1945, but a civil affairs officer named Lambert knew the Washington stamps were going to be late, and so he, with a Philippine general, authorized the creation of the Victory hand stamp as a temporary means of validating the military action, getting a few pennies back into the Philippine government so that stolen stamps during the Japanese occupation would not be used for free. So in 44 or 45, you needed to have a stamp with the word hand stamp victory or Washington printed Victory and Commonwealth as a legitimate stamp. The missing image was in several publications. It was a plate number single with 131-580, the next serial number from the 131-579, and it's a bottom plate number single. It's the first reported use of the stamp. I researched the records in Washington, D.C. after Philippine independence and GIs were overseas. They finally got home and they were trying to rebuild their collection of stamps when 12 million Americans served in the U.S. military in World War II. So in 45 and 46, they were getting out of the U.S. military and they were trying to rebuild their stamp collections. So after Philippine independence in July 4th, 1946, the U.S. Bureau of Printing and Engraving printed some stamps in November 1946 that were sent to the Philippine Embassy in January 1947, and they were intended to be sold to former active duty American military so they could fill up their collections with the stamps that they did not collect when you were overseas. And so, not bragging, when you're overseas, you're not worried about collecting stamps. Trust me. I'm sorry I'm running late on time. Official business stamps, top left, normal blue, normal 4-cent green stamp, Washington applied, large OB. Stamp on the right, smaller size OB, possibly printed in 1940, 1941, smaller letters. Bottom left, a stamp sent to Greater Leyte area, returned for hand stamping with the word victory. Please roll. Some stamps were captured by the Japanese forces in January or December 41 and January 42. So the Japanese went to the Manila post office that had a large supply of Washington stamps, and they used the basic Washington green stamps and put their own local overprint on the Washington supplied stamp. The lower plate block, there's a pencil arrow and a white arrow. There's a crack or a break in the Japanese letter. I have no idea what the break means. It's someone in the past had excellent eyes and found a flaw in the overprint. Please roll. Earlier, we're talking about flights between Europe and Philippines, or in this case, a British flight flew from England through India and eventually down to Australia. They made a U-turn at Australia and they came up to the Philippines and eventually wound up in Singapore. The gentleman who led the flight has, and I'm looking at the top, it says RAF Group Captain Henry Myrick Cave or Cove Brown Brown Cave. So I wrote this up very simply because I never met a gentleman with 3 last names, and I don't know how to pronounce for sure whether it's Cave or Cove Brown and Cave, but anyway, some Englishmen did successfully fly from Europe to Australia back to Singapore, and so these stamps are locally printed and overprinted with the red biplane in Manila. Please roll. Now, I hope somebody is familiar with the Piper Cub dive bomber. This happens to be from the former British territory of Papua New Guinea. And this stamp was printed in 1930. And the plane, the hand stamp or the overprint is inverted on the basic $1 green, which is fine. And the plane appears to be nominally dive bombing. Please roll. So in 1933, Philippines said, "Me too." And the dive bombing plane from Papua New Guinea in 1930 got reprinted on the lower left green stamps with the plane kind of in a dive bombing mode. There are 4 plate numbers for the green stamps. They're fairly common. The rare green stamp is a green stamp with a bottom plate number position. For some reason, there are plenty of top number positions. The other 2 stamps at the top were selected for color contrast, but the plane appears to be in level flight and not being a dive bomber, as I alluded to in the past. And the red stamp was obviously printed in the Philippines, somehow made it to the greater Leyte area, and had the victory hand stamp applied in 1944 and 1945. In 1944 and 1945, there was no civilian airmail service in Leyte Island or the Gulf of Leyte. The only planes flying were U.S. fighter planes and Japanese Zeros. So the airmails served normal purpose. Finally, Washington printed stamps for the Philippines, intentionally and properly airmail stamps. A great number of these were captured at the Manila Post Office, and please roll. And the Japanese did what they normally did. They took the American produced stamp and they applied their local overprints. And so the greatest insult you can give to your enemy is to seize the American stamp and put Japanese letters on top of the American stamp. And so again, traditional plate blocks, normal, available, eBay. Please roll. Special delivery stamps. The plate number on the top was used from 1906 until November 1946. So yes, it printed every stamp, every special delivery stamp, and even printed the stamps after Philippine independence. There are many combinations of perforations and ink shades. The bottom left is the 1925 specimen stamp from the Manila Post Office. The Rasdale Company that apart as a block of 4 and not as a block of 6. There is one known top block of 4 and a bottom block of 4 here, so there is no block of 6. Multiples are known with the specimen hand stamp. Sometime in late 1920s or 1930s, they printed some extra supplemental plates on the lower right. The unique part of the stamp at the lower right, they added the letter F as to indicate the plate was finished in hard chrome. So there are 3 supplemental numbers rather, 8, 11, 12, and 13. The upper right position has the F, and please roll. Again, the stamps were preserved through the Japanese occupation, ultimately returned to Leyte. These stamps images came from a fellow named Rich Pounder, a gentleman in New Jersey. The stamps at the left have hand stamps on the first 3 upper rows. The bottom row does not have any hand stamps above the 812 plate number and no hand stamp on the printer's initial in the bottom. I kind of think the bottom pair of stamps in the salvage were bent under and the hand stamping happened, and at some point in time, somebody unfolded the stamp, and we have a one-of-a-kind combination on the left-hand side. There are the same stamp, a Philippine E9 with the victory. There are possibly 8 or 10 traditional plate blocks or bottom singles, bottom pairs of the E9 on the top right, and the E8s on the left are very difficult to find. Please roll. Washington produced postage due stamps for one time and for the Philippines. In 1928, they sent the majority of them to the Philippines. The upper left stamp doesn't have an overprint. The plate block in the middle, the Philippine government overprinted 3 cents for a business reply folded postcard. And some of those stamps were seized in Manila. The Japanese put in the blue deleting line, knocking out the United States. And then the bottom stamps have the word victory. Brother Craig Eggleston is a very good and faithful friend and student of history. For decades, I had no idea of how many 3-cent stamps were overprinted, and possibly 5 years ago, I got a very nice letter from Greg. He had been checking a magazine or a journal of the day, and he told me that they printed 250,000 of the 3-cent overprints. So with Craig's help, we now know the total of every postage due stamp printed or used. The bottom one is a reconstructed. I bought the right 4 stamps a certain year. 20 years later, I found the other 4 stamps and they perfectly match, and the pencils markings in the salvage are 4, 5, 6, and 7. Please roll. Ah, after General Wainwright had to surrender on Corregidor Island in May, some of the southern islands either had local resistance and or certain U.S. military did not surrender. On the island of Cebu, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, they printed stamps out there. So if you look at the 2 centers, or they were printed in strips of 5 and 2 repeats on the pink paper. The left 6 number 2 numerals are thick. The 4 numerals on the right are thin on the 2 cent. And when you move to the 4 cent, the combination is just reversed. So they kept the same frame, they kept the same lettering, they removed the denominations. The 4 stamps on the left have a larger, fatter, wider 4, and the 6 stamps on the right have a smaller, thinner 4. The last one at the bottom came from Mr. Gene Garrett, and the way they printed this stamp is really kind of weird. And there are no plate numbers on any of these stamps. They put the sheet of paper in the printing press, and they applied the 20 and the 16 at the top right at the first impression. Then they turned the paper 180 degrees and applied the 20 cent and the 16 a second time. Then they took the sheet of paper, took it out, put it back into the printing press, and printed the back side, which you see in shadow. So they took one sheet of paper. There were 4 impressions, 2 pairs on the front, 2 pairs on the right. Mr. Gene Garrett said the signature on the stamps was the name of the postmaster at a town that I don't remember, but it was the authentication signature from the postmaster in a town in the southern part of Cebu that was not occupied by the Japanese until sometime in 1943. Please roll. These beautiful gems are Mindanao Gorilla stamps. They are printed in panes of 25. They were printed in Australia. They were put aboard an American submarine called the Narwhal. It was an out-of-date American submarine, but very large. It carried a heck of a lot of weapons and ammunition and radios to the Philippines to a Colonel Furtick on the island of Mindanao. They were delivered sometime in possibly December 43. So they were used in December 43, all of 44 and 45. Most of the stamps and the envelopes would be considered favor cancel. The stamps were knife cut or part and put on letters and then hand carried either for legitimate mail or for military propaganda purposes. The essence was Colonel Furtick on the island of Mindanao was in touch with General MacArthur in Australia, and the stamps were proof that there was contact between Australia and Mindanao. There's also a unrelated story when the submarine it pulled up to a concrete dock. Colonel Furtick had 5 or 10 trucks on the dock, and there was a local band playing Anchors Away while the submarine was unloaded. There were Japanese troops 10 miles to the left and 10 miles to the right, but the submarine successfully used this concrete dock on the north side of Mindanao for several years. Please roll. Now, in closing, the beautiful green stamps and red stamps were originally sent to Manila, and in 1930, the U.S. Navy commander on Guam Island was a 100% U.S. Navy military reservation or base. So the Navy commander was civilian governor and everything else in between. So they got stamps from Manila and they applied the overprint locally on Guam, and there are eventually 2 sizes. These are the small size. There's 2,000 of possibly the green and 4,000 of the reds. Even finding a plate number single is extremely rare, but they do exist. Please roll for the next one. After they sold out the initial issue of Guam stamps, or the first Guam guard mail stamps, they got more full sheets of 100. They had a bigger size font, and they printed a Guam guard mail in a larger size for the later issue, and they are fairly common on eBay. And I think the last stamp is, or the last slide is next. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for listening. I'm sorry I ran over. Folks at the bottom have sent me images and stamps over time. So Rich Pounder, Mike Barut, Bob Odenweller, Bill Schulman, and Gil Plass. Many of the folks listed here have passed away, but we do thank our ancestors who preserved the things that we collect today. So with that, I will shut up. I apologize for being too long. And if anyone has a question, I'll be glad to answer you now or send me an email, and I'll be glad to call you or email you, whatever you prefer. Thank you, and please have a great day for the rest of your time in San Francisco.
Thank you, Joe. Much appreciated. Does any